Hi, welcome to your 4.5 flip video. 4.5 is subtracting rational numbers. So just how 4.2 and 4.3 were kind of paired together, it was adding integers, then adding rational numbers, 4.2, then 4.3. 4.4 and 4.5 does the same thing. So 4.4 was subtracting integers, and 4.5 is subtracting rational numbers. That's why we go back to back. Okay, so why bother pairing it like that? Well, rational numbers are the integers plus some other numbers, which are a little more complicated. So let's just go ahead and talk about what a rational number is, just a quick review. So rational numbers are your natural numbers, all the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to infinity, plus whole numbers, so 0, plus your integers, so negative numbers included, and anything that you can write in the form a over b or negative a over b. So I put the negative sign in brackets, which means that you can either opt in or opt out to have it, okay? So what does that mean? Well, it's the integers, so negative numbers, positive numbers, and 0, fractions, and decimals. So anything that you can write in the form a over b or negative a over b is a rational number. The only numbers that you've had really access to or exposure to that aren't rational are like square root of -1, pi, the golden ratios, types of those types of things. So really this is how to subtract integers, fractions, and decimals. So we have two big ideas here, and these are the same two big ideas that came from 4.4. Subtracting a positive, so a is positive, b is positive over here. Subtracting a positive number is the exact same thing as adding the negative, okay? So let's look at some examples. 5 minus 3, subtracting a positive is the exact same thing as adding a negative. It doesn't matter if this was -5 or if it's +5. What we're looking at is this: subtracting a negative, subtracting a positive, adding the negative, okay? So we have those. Let me get rid of the pink really quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an integer example, a decimal example, and a fraction example for both of these two equations. So same thing, 4.1 minus 11.3, subtracting a positive, is the same thing as adding the negative, 4.1 plus negative 11.3, okay? Let me fix that first equation, 5 plus -3. There we go. All right, so now fraction 1, 2/3 plus -4/5. All right, so instead of going this way, subtracting a negative, we can also go the other way. So I'm adding the negative, so we can go backwards. So 2/3 plus -4/5 is the same thing as 2/3 minus 4/5. All right, so this might be helpful for you to use on a quiz or a test or something, because I think it's easier to think of 2/3 plus -4/3 as 2/3 minus 4/5, because it is an easier thing to think about subtraction in that manner, okay? The other big equation idea that we talked about in 4.4, it's the exact same thing, we're just now applying it to fractions and decimals, is a minus .b. So subtracting a negative number is the same thing as adding a positive. So really there is this is positive b. If you'll remember the 4.4 flip video, one of the questions that popped up was, can you assume 4 is really positive 4? Well, yeah, we don't write the positive 4. Otherwise, to write something like 2 plus 3, you would have to write positive 2 plus positive 3. It gets messy very quickly. So if you don't see a negative, you can assume it's positive. So that's why we don't write those positives in there. But subtracting the negative, same thing as adding the positives. So I think about it, you know, if you take the minus signs and combine them together, they make a plus sign. You can also think as two negatives next to each other cancel each other out. So let's look at some examples. Integer example, 50 minus -6 is the same thing as 50 plus +6. But we don't write this +6. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. We don't write this plus 6, so we would just write this as 50 plus 6. All right, fraction example or decimal example, 2.5 minus -14.2 is the exact same thing, 2.5 plus positive 14.2. Again, it doesn't matter if this first number is positive or negative. we're only looking at this interaction. We're only looking to see the ones that go back to back, okay? Fraction example, 10 over 12 plus 1 over 12. So just like in the other one, you can go from left to right or right to left. You know, all of the ones we've looked at so far have been going from negative, negative to positive, positive. You can also go positive, positive to negative, negative. So 10 over 12 plus 1 over 12 is the same thing as 10 over 12 minus negative 1, minus negative 1 over 12, okay? So they're the exact same thing. Whoop, excuse me. All right. Let me get rid of the arrows really quick. And there we go. Okay, so you might want to jot down these two equations. Subtracting a positive is the same thing as adding the negative, and subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding a positive. Okay, so let's look at some problems. I'm going to do one example for both, for integers, fractions, and decimals. So we'll have 6 total problems on this page. So the first one, 2,150 plus negative 23. I think it's easier to think about as 2,150 minus positive 23, or just minus 23. And if you subtract the two, 2,127. All right, so now let's look at a fraction example. So 2 over 9 plus negative 1/3, we can rewrite. So let's get common denominators first, because if you're adding fractions or subtracting fractions, you need common denominators. So I went from 1/3 over to negative 1/3 over to negative 3/9 by multiplying by 3 over 3. So 1 times 3 is 3. 3 times 3 is 9. All right, so now I have 2 9s plus negative 3 9s, which I can rewrite as 2 9s minus 3 9s, because adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting the positive. So 2/3 minus 2 9s minus 3 9s. Well, 2 minus 3 is negative 1, so negative 1/9. All right, now let's look at a decimal example. 10.4 minus 1.26, and we know that 1.26 is positive. We just don't write that positive next to it, so I'm subtracting a positive. So subtracting the positive is the same thing as adding the negative. So 10.4 plus negative 1.26 gives me, well, I'm going to throw a 0 on after the 4, because 0.26 is 2 decimals long, and this one's only 1 decimal long. So if I do the 2 decimals, it's easier to see, I think. So 10.40 plus negative 1.26, which I can rewrite as 10.4. Excuse me, we already flipped it, right? We subtracted a negative at or subtracted a positive at the beginning, and then right here, that's where we flip to adding the negative. So subtracting a positive is the same thing as adding the negative. So 10.40 plus negative 1.26 is 9.14. All right, so now let's look at the second equation that we looked at, the negative, negative adding a positive. So negative 23 minus negative 3, I can rewrite as negative 23 plus positive 23. So it's like these two negatives cancel each other out. All right. So negative 23 plus positive 3 is negative 20. All right. Fraction form, a 1/8 minus negative 2/5. Let's go ahead and get common denominators. Well, what's shared between 8 and 5? The smallest number is 40. So how do you go from a denominator of 8 to a denominator of 40? You multiply by 5 over 5. So 1 times 5 is 5. 8 times 5 is 40. We're going to do the same thing for negative 2/5, but we're going to multiply by 8 over 8, because then I get 5 times 8 is 40. And then 2 times 8 is 16. So now I have 5 over 40 minus negative 16 over 40, which I can rewrite as 5 over 40 plus positive 16 over 40, which I think that's easier to look at conceptually. 5/40 plus 16/40, 21/40. Okay, you can't reduce that, so that's your final answer. Last problem, 21.2 plus 4.6. So just like how you can go from subtracting the negative is the same thing as adding a positive. You can go the other way too. Adding a positive, same thing as subtracting the negative. So I can rewrite 21.2 plus 4.6 as 21.2 minus negative 4.6. I can't think of an example where you would need to do this in the real world unless you had like more problem over here and you had like a 4.6. Positive 4.6, and then you wanted to, get additive inverses, but I think we're stretching. We just need to be able to be fluent moving back and forth between the two forms. So 21.2 minus negative 4.6 gives me 25.8. And that's it for this flip video. It's really just the ideas from 4-4, but now we're applying them also to fractions and decimals. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.